So we will start with the first presentation now. Laurel Townhead from Quaker United Nations Office, who is representative for human rights and refugees. As mentioned earlier, Laurel's work includes using the UN human rights system to support the right to conscientious objection to military service in law and in practice. She first worked on conscientious objection 17 years ago as research assistant for the Ülke case at the European Court of Human Rights. Um, so the floor is Laurel's now. Thank you, Laurel.
Thank you so much, Zemi. I'm just going to take a moment to find my presentation. Okay, thank you all for being here and for joining us for this webinar. So it's my job to give a brief introduction at the beginning, and I'll give a brief overview of what is the UN human rights system and how can it be used in your campaigns for conscientious objection to military service. And I'll skip quickly over some parts which will be covered in more detail by our subsequent presenters. So don't worry, the whole presentation will be sent, but I won't say everything, otherwise we'll be here for too long with me talking. So just to start by saying that I just need to work out how I change. Yeah, within the UN human rights system, there is no treaty that explicitly says that there's a right to conscientious objection to military service, but the system has very clearly recognized that it is a right protected in international law. And we've got three different parts of the human rights system here, each of which we'll touch on in this webinar today. And there's a quote there from each of them, and all of them essentially say that there is a right to conscientious objection to military service because there's a right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And because that's protected, the right to conscientious objection to military service is protected. And so why would we think that the UN human rights system is relevant for campaigning for conscientious objection to military service? Well, partly because it sets these standards. It has this role in creating international law and interpreting international law, but also because it can provide oversight and accountability for the commitments that states have made. So a space to challenge whether governments are actually doing what they've said they will do. And also that it can provide guidance and technical assistance. So it can speak to what governments should be doing to make sure that somebody can safely claim that right as a conscientious objector. And this makes it relevant to both countries that do not have any recognition of conscientious objection to military service, where that can be challenged, the complete lack of recognition, but also it's relevant for countries where there is a recognition of conscientious objection to military service, but in practice there continue to be rights violations. Either the alternative service is punitive or the way in which you get recognized as a conscientious objector is unfair, for example. So what is the UN human rights system when we use this phrase? It's made up of lots of different parts. This is an organogram from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which shows that there are many different parts. So I'll just speak to a few of them today. And the idea is really that I give a bit of technical introduction to what it is, and then our two subsequent presentations will give some real practical kind of depth on what some of those things are, and that hopefully we can use the Q&A and the session at the end to find out how we can help support people to engage with the system where they want to. So starting first with the Human Rights Council. This is a political body. It's made up of governments representing their positions and their priorities. It's an intergovernmental body intended to strengthen the promotion and protection of human rights and address situations of human rights violations. It's meeting right now in Geneva in virtual format, as we all are, but it's currently in session. And one way to think about the Human Rights Council is to think about its roles listening, so receiving reports, holding debates and discussions, but also in speaking, so providing a space into which registered NGOs, states can speak about about their position on human rights, but also the council speaks as a group of member states. It passes resolutions. There's a quote, one of the first quotes there about the recognition of the right to conscientious objection is from a Human Rights Council resolution. So that's that state saying, what can we say together as a group of governments on this particular right, on this particular situation at this moment in time. There's some lists of some parts of its work and some entry points, but thinking specifically about conscientious objection, there are some particular things which are of use in your potentially of use in your campaigning. One is that there's a report from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is scheduled to come every 4 years. And that contains information on conscientious objection around the world and recommendations for governments. And any organisation could submit information to that. You don't need any kind of special standing. The Council has passed several resolutions on conscientious objection, currently on a 4-year cycle. And these have provided clarity about the law, but they've also provided some additional standards. So, for example, the alternative service must be in line with the reasons for objection. Resolutions can also ask for follow-up activity from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So, for example, they can ask for specific reports. There is the debates and dialogues on the reports with special procedures, and we'll speak briefly about the special procedures in a minute. And they're an opportunity for people to raise questions and recommendations in the council. So now we'll speak to the special procedures. That's another part of the UN's human rights system. And Lee will speak more about this because she is the chair of the working group on arbitrary detention, which is a special procedure of the Human Rights Council. This is a term we use, which doesn't really make very much sense in usual English, but it's a term that's used for the group of independent experts who can advise on themes or on countries. And they're not employed by the UN or by member states. They're independent and they provide technical advice and expertise around specific human rights situations, specific human rights issues. They have a variety of activities, some of which Lee will touch on, and there are a variety of entry points for NGOs as well, and particularly in relation to your work as campaigning for conscientious objection, it's worth thinking about the country visits that special procedures can do, that you can supply information before they visit. It's possible sometimes to meet with the special procedures. They'll meet with the government, with NGOs, with human rights defenders, and then prepare a report analysing the situation in the country and then making recommendations to the government. Also, special procedures will produce thematic reports, which may be relevant to conscientious objection. And again, you don't need any particular registration or type of NGO in order to be able to submit information to these. And finally, they can receive communications about individual human rights violations. And Lee will probably speak a little bit more about the specific role that the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has. Moving on to the Universal Periodic Review, which is another part that was in that organogram of the human rights system. The Universal Periodic Review is an intergovernmental process, so government to government, to review the human rights record of every country once every 5 years and to make recommendations. Now, NGOs like us can't make recommendations directly, but we can give information to try and make sure that the things that we care about, the things that are happening for conscientious objectors are taken into account, and ideally that recommendations are made to your governments about better upholding the right to conscientious objection to military service. There's a little diagram here of seeing the UPR as a cycle. So even if your government isn't up for review in the next few months, in the next year, they'll be at some point in this cycle, and there are different ways to engage depending where they are in that cycle. And again, I'm going to skip over some of this quite quickly, but we'll share the slides afterwards so you can read it with more time later. And in terms of what ways in there are for NGOs, for organisations, for conscientious objectors, you can submit written information to the UPR around 8 months in advance of a country being reviewed. And again, you don't need any special status to be able to do that. So you can submit written information, and IFOR, so Zaire, regularly submits information on conscientious objection to military service. You can also try and engage with the countries who might make recommendations about conscientious objection to another government. So there's a group of countries who have done this in the past and who might be likely to do it again, and you can engage with them in Geneva, in the capitals of those countries, but also in the country that you're in. If there's an embassy, then it's they will sometimes be open to receiving information there. So it doesn't necessarily require travel. It doesn't necessarily require a lot of in-person contact. and suggested recommendations can be shared with them. That's something which we regularly do, and it's something which I4 has done in bringing conscientious objectors to Geneva to meet with diplomats to explain what the situation is in a particular country, to encourage them to make the recommendations. And then the UPR is intended to be a process of consultation and dialogue. And so where it's safe to do so, it can be an opening for dialogue with your government. So that will depend on the safety for you and the safety in your country to do that. But that can be a moment that opens the possibility for dialogue before they report or once they've received the recommendations from other countries. There's a slide in here on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to look at later. And then the last part of the system I wanted to speak about, and hopefully George will speak a bit more about their experience of this, is the treaty bodies. So this is groups of independent experts who monitor the implementation of a human rights treaty where a country has signed up to it. There are 9 core treaty bodies, that's them listed there. The one that's most relevant for us on work on conscientious objection is the Human Rights Committee, because that oversees the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which contains the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. There are different ways to engage with it in terms of when it receives reports from countries, and in terms of its work on interpretive guidance and on cases. So when a state is going to report, you can send in information. And again, that doesn't require you to have a particular registration with the UN to send that kind of information. You can send suggested recommendations, and you can watch as your country is reviewed by the Human Rights Committee to see what is said to them, to see what's recommended. You can also submit cases, individual cases, to treaty bodies if your country has said that they accept that. So there's quite a big limitation on that, but where that's possible, you can submit cases. And again, hopefully George will speak a little bit about the experience in Greece of using this. So when would you consider working with the UN system as part of your campaigning? And I think it depends on where you're at in your campaigns, what you would like to do. But for example, the submissions to reports and reviews, that's all got a timeline of its own. So you can't just turn up and say, I want to submit on the UPR. It depends on what its timeline is. So part of the work is then about looking at where are the moments when your country will be reviewed? Where are the moments when a report in conscientious objection is coming up? Do you already have information you can adapt? Or is this something you'd like to invest time and energy in preparing for? And good submissions will contain clear information detailing rights violations, but also relevant laws and policies, as well as what's happening to individuals, and clear recommendations. And it's always worth thinking, do you think it will actually help your campaign if the UN recommends this to your government? In relation to individual cases, it's important to emphasize this is not a quick solution. This is a slow process. It can be very effective in changing laws ultimately, but it's definitely not a quick process. And as I mentioned, the state in question has to have accepted that it will take individual cases. And then the question about whether it's a good approach or not are the same questions as were asked in the litigation, the strategic litigation seminar, webinar that we did previously. And finally, so what has been achieved by previous engagement on conscientious objection in the human rights system? So firstly and crucially, recognition of the right to CO as a right protected in international law, progressive clarification of what international law says about what should actually happen to enable a person to safely claim their right as a conscientious objector. It's had an impact on the decisions of national courts, including constitutional courts, and we heard a bit about that from the case studies of both Colombia and Republic of Korea last time. It has ordered remedy for individual cases. It provides a space where other governments can show their support for the right to conscientious objection, to conscientious objection and for conscientious objectors. And it provides tools for national activists and organizations to use with their governments. So finally, just to say, I think it can be a useful part of a strategy alongside the other pieces that we're touching on in this webinar series. And that's where I'll leave it for now.